Good evening, and welcome to this Southeast Vermont SISMA webinar. The SISMA acronym stands for Cooperative Invasive Species Management Association. We are a partnership of invasive plant experts, public and private land managers, and engaged members of the public. We work to raise awareness of invasive species, leverage collective action in volunteer projects, and provide resources and assistance to the community. In this webinar, we will introduce our presenters, quickly review some important terminology, discuss why early detection rapid response, or EDRR, are important, discuss employing EDRR on your land and in our region. We will also provide some identification resources for some of our early detection species, and there will be time for questions and answers at the conclusion of the presentation. Tonight's presenters are myself, Corey Ross, District Manager for the Windham County Natural Resources Conservation District, Jennifer Garrett, Regional Stewardship Manager for Vermont Land Trust, and Jack Minnick, Land Management Coordinator for the Vermont Land Trust. An invasive species, for the purposes of this program, is a non-native species that has been introduced by human activity and that is able to monopolize resources to the detriment of native species. And when we talk about early detection rapid response, this is the detection and control of an invasion early while it is still small and manageable. And now allow me to introduce Jack Minnick.
Great, thanks so much, Corey. So when we talk about early detection and rapid response, it's important to consider why it matters. And this graph pulled from the excellent state website, VT Invasives, really does a good job of summing up why EDR matters. As you travel along the x-axis from left to right, the scale of an infestation on a property grows, and with it, things like public awareness, but also the control of cost, or the cost to control that infestation. This chart makes it very easy to understand where you would like to be. Ideally, you are somewhere in the early stages of an infestation when you find a new invasive plant on your property or on a property, because the cost of control is really low. And usually that's when you have the most, or the broadest array of treatment methods available to you. And usually treatment methods that are significantly easier to employ. Next slide. And so this is going to be just a really quick case study, not necessarily in the spread of an invasive plant, but rather the spread of public awareness, which is a key variable in early detection rapid response, and one that drives a lot of outcomes in the control of invasive plants, but also the ability to kind of contain costs across multiple scales. So Corey, if you would go through and click through. So I pulled from iNaturalist observations of Japanese knotweed in our region across multiple years. And while this is mainly showing who is using the app, so the number of people, obviously as iNaturalist got older, they got more users, so thus you'd probably expect to see more observations. But this is also just showing how many more observations of Japanese knotweed popped up. And so think of this not so much as a reflection of Japanese knotweed's distribution across the state, but rather the amount of attention it's receiving from the public. And so 2011, very little. We could probably chalk that up to early stages of the app. And we start to see it grow throughout 2012 and 2013. Probably seeing, those news articles coming out saying that following Irene, knotweed's expected to spread. And you can see just as we travel through time, the amount of attention that knotweed gets in these, as measured by these individual sightings, grows pretty exponentially. And kind of terrifyingly, if we go over all the way to the next slide, we can see in 2017, in 2018, and 2019, just the sheer volume of public attention that's being devoted to Japanese knotweed. is immense, but as we know, as we are living in the present, this is just last year, the scale of the problem is also immense, and one that is quite hard to fathom dealing with. And so if we think about why does EDR matter, it matters because when infestations are small or when they are a problem but are manageable, that is usually when we do not have the amount of public attention needed to actually deal with that plant. And unfortunately, we usually have to wait till things look like this before we start to mobilize enough resources to actually address issues or to develop techniques or funding to address them at various scales. Next slide. So talking about scales of early detection, rapid response, those maps show us, across a region, a kind of a version of EDR. And when we think of early detection, rapid response, I immediately picture international borders and a TSA agent stock photo. And then once it is kind of within the US, I usually think public land, and then you've got, your whole suite of the feds, you've got state, local, nonprofits, you've got, you and I engage people who care about our public lands. But beyond that, the part that we don't necessarily think too much about is private property. And that includes you, it includes me, it includes corporations and nonprofits, and anyone else that really owns or manages private land. And unfortunately, as much as we would kind of like to see the federal agencies, the state agencies, and local government really spearhead control of invasive plants, you can see based on the distribution of private property and public land that things aren't necessarily set up for that to happen. So Corey, if you could click one more time, 60% of private or 60% of the US is private property, and only 40% is public land, which really places the onus of invasive plant control, and especially early detection, rapid response, on ourselves as individual private citizens, corporations, or nonprofits. Next slide. So now that we kind of have the reasoning behind why EDR matters and matters for you, we'll look at a few case studies that explores the topic of EDR on kind of a private land scenario. So we'll start with this case study looking at a VLT land. This is the King Farm up in Woodstock. It's not in Southeast Vermont, although I guess it depends on your definition of Southeast Vermont. But over on the left here, we can see it without invasives mapped. And then on the right, we can see with invasives mapped. And this will be a great case study to explore two kind of general questions around EDRR and two general truths about EDRR that we'll dive into both in my segment and in Jen's. So Corey, if you could click through. So two questions to consider while we analyze these case studies. How do you know where to look, and what do you do if you find something? And then two general themes that I find always come up in EDR situations is if it's new to the property, it's an EDR situation. It doesn't really matter if it's, glossy buckthorn, which is well established everywhere else. If it's new to the property, it's EDR. And the other truth is just even infested areas can have EDR situations. And we'll kind of explore all of these components in these case studies. Next slide. So obviously you can see on the two maps here, one has invasive plants mapped, the other doesn't. And let's start by considering where to look for invasive plants if you're gonna do your due diligence for EDR's sake. By looking at this map that doesn't have invasive plants mapped. Pretty much the only place where there aren't invasive plants on this kind of old agricultural property is this unfragmented dark hemlock forest. And beyond that, pretty much everywhere is somewhat impacted by invasive plants. And we can use an analysis of where is it impacted to kind of understand maybe why that unfragmented dark hemlock forest is doing so well. So Corey, if you just want to click through these. So the patterns that emerge when you look at the invasive species that were identified on the property are things like places where lots of light is hitting the forest floor. transition zones between natural communities or places where there's a lot of human travel via vehicle or foot. And Corey, you can just keep clicking through these. Places by water, former agricultural sites, places where land management practices change, and really anywhere where there's human travel. Corey, just keep clicking through. So the big themes to take away from this kind of analysis, prioritize places where humans go. And unfortunately, we are huge spreaders of invasive plants ourselves. So anywhere where a foot falls or a bicycle tire goes or a car tire goes, you should be checking your property in that area regularly. Any areas where there's hard transitions between natural communities, you know, think birds perching in trees above a field edge, or places where that sit right along like a little streak or stream bed where you would get lots of wildlife activity. Areas with any soil disturbance of any kind, be they past or present. And then, like we said, any place with lots of light hitting the forest floor. Areas near water, that's just going to see so much more wildlife traffic and be so susceptible to damage by invasive plant infestations that it's really worth prioritizing those areas. And then anywhere where you might see kind of a gradient of land management practices. I don't mean to throw any neighbors under the bus, but I'm sure we can all think of someone who lived next to you who maybe didn't keep on top of their invasive plants as much as you would like that they would. And then another case study to consider. So we kind of know where to prioritize looking now, but let's see it applied. So this is a property up in Andover. It's a really beautiful forest. It's very intact, except for we've got this huge power line running through it. And this has been present for quite a long time. So when we were looking at this property, thinking about where to go, considering it's such a large property, we focused on that in particular. And sure enough, we turned up this old common buckthorn plant. And common buckthorn, it maybe isn't as present in a lot of people's yards unless you're a farmer. It's mainly associated with old agricultural properties and is not as common as glossy buckthorn. I'm sure someone in another part of the state is going to disagree with me on that. But this common buckthorn plant been established in the region for decades, if not 100+ years. And it's still considered an EDR situation for this property because it is a relatively small new infestation, new in the sense of new to us. So that gets at kind of how to prioritize and this truth that no matter what the species, if it's new to the property, it's an EDR situation. So let's click over. And so we've covered how to prioritize, where to look, but what do you do if you actually find something? And this is a case study also from the King Farm, and Peter Van Loan, the forester with VLT, and I believe Jennifer, you were involved on this too. This is a great example of what to do if you find something. So up here, up kind of by the canopy gap disturbance, there was a little black swallowwort seedling found. And I believe Peter was the first one to see this. And he basically communicated with many people on VLT staff and kind of set in motion a program to remove this individual and deal with follow-up monitoring. And so we can click through and see those steps. So for you, these would pretty much be similar steps. You would research what the actual individual is and any kind of treatment techniques that would apply. You would implement those treatment techniques, and you would make sure you flag the spot so that at any given time you could go back there and actually see where it was. And then you would just continue monitoring and reapplying treatment techniques until you have that infestation under control and ideally removed from the property. And so this is one that we still go back to. This is now going on 8 months, 9 months, maybe more, and we still revisit this site to check on this individual. And this kind of hits home that other idea of, if it's even in places as rough as the King Farm at the moment, you can still have an EDR situation amidst a broader, more established infested property. So to kind of recap this cycle of EDR, now that you know how to prioritize and what to do if you find something, let's rehash. You are essentially gonna just continue to keep up to date on what invasives are present in your region, and what new might be coming into the region using VT invasives. And a particularly good thing to keep up on is the phenology of individual species. And phenology is just nature's timing. So when you would be able to see that plant, when that plant might be flowering or just progressing through life stages. So once you have a good handle on that, you're just gonna go and walk your property or drive your property or whatever you do to get out and look at those kind of key priority areas. And ideally this occurs in spring and late summer, and that way you're catching both those herbaceous species that kind of tend to disappear pretty early on in fall, but you're also catching those woody species that stick out a lot more in the fall and late summer. And of course, you're gonna walk everywhere else because you love getting out on your land, but really focusing on priority areas. And then when you find something, just like what we did at the King Farm, you're gonna research techniques, and you are, if you're ever in doubt, you can always contact the SISMA or your local invasive plant control specialist, excuse me. And then you're just gonna implement control and just continue to repeat this cycle. And that's EDR in a nutshell. And I'm gonna hand it off to Jennifer, who's gonna talk about some specific species to look out for in our region. Take it away. Jen, you are muted, I think.
Thank you. So for my section of the presentation, the main takeaway here is that the state is really interested in tracking invasive plants that are new to the state or that are near our borders and are likely to invade Vermont in the coming years. And there are resources, mechanisms, and procedures for getting the public involved in this process. As Jack said, it's really great to have public awareness in order to further this effort. So new invasives are a constant threat. People, vehicles, machines move plants locally and from afar. And one of the other factors involved is climate change. Climate change may encourage invasiveness, both from plants that we already have here that are not native and might not be behaving invasive, or for plants that are more comfortable in warmer climates but may feel comfortable moving further north as the years progress. So state ecology and agricultural officials try to track these species. Apps like iNaturalist allow citizens to share their observations, and the state has an invasive plant coordinator, Elizabeth Spinney from Forests, Parks, and Recreation, and she and others, including our state botanists, receive these records. They look at iNaturalist. They also receive reports directly, which I'll get into a little bit. And they try to adjust them. They try to confirm them, track them down, and figure out if there's a way to nip them in the bud. And I'll get into more about what the state wants us to do if we find something. But if you go on VT invasives and you find the report it page, you'll see a list of plants. These are These are EDRR plants. The list is not comprehensive. The state is interested in learning about any new invasive that you might come across that might not be here. For example, I see one Ficaria, which is also known as lesser celandine. I know that they're very interested in tracking that one. So there are others that you might not see on the list, but are important as well. So yeah, we can move on. So yeah, and I'll go over a few species to keep an eye out for. I won't have time to go over, you know, a giant list, but there on VT invasives, there's a great list, and there are a lot of identification resources there. There's also a way to report a record if you find an EDRR plant, or you think you do. Elizabeth Spinney has told me that the preferred way to report that record is directly through VT Invasives website. Here's a link here. You can't click on it because you're watching a presentation, but if you Google Vermont invasives report it, you will find that location, and with steps to report your observation. Be prepared to upload photos and a specific location. And then, you know, once you do that, it's also helpful to report it on iNaturalist. At some point, we may have a presentation on these apps to learn a little bit more about them. If you haven't looked at it yet, iNaturalist is a great site for tracking all kinds of things, invasives and native plants, as well as insects, animals, and fungi. So I'm going to dive into a plant that is currently of pretty great concern in Windham County. It's called Japanese stilt grass. It's a fast colonizing annual that likes disturbed habitats. It can really quickly establish and form a carpet. I believe the introduction to the United States from Asia was accidental. So this is a grass, and some people find identifying grasses a little challenging. And there are a few species that look similar to it. So again, I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, but VT Invasives anticipates this issue, and they have great resources for comparing this plant with lookalikes. And of course, you can always email us if you have a question. So, but I will get into the distinguishing characters a little bit. It has pale green leaves with a stripe. It's a shiny stripe, and sometimes it's more prominent than others. It also has these really interesting roots that prop it up above the soil, and so it is an annual. It's very easy to pull out. And then if you have a hand lens and you know what the collar of the grass is, that's where the leaf meets the stem. You will see hairs there. So it's an annual. It's pretty easy to pull. One thing to keep in mind is that it flowers and fruits in the fall. So if you see it, it's really best to be on top of it early in the year and just start pulling it like crazy. It does spread a little bit on its own asexually, but it is an annual, so when it's done, it's done. A really good thing to do is to keep the seeds from being formed and dropped. Yep, you can go to the next one. So this is a picture of my hand after I pulled some in Brattleboro. iNaturalist is showing that there's the confirmed location in Brattleboro, and there's unconfirmed locations in Dover and Bellows Falls. And I believe there are some other potential locations across the state. In Brattleboro, if you're from the area, it's on along High Lawn Road and William Street along the Whetstone Brook. It's actually in the brook, and we're really worried about it moving. So there's a small group of people that that alerted the state about the issue, and we're hoping to pull some efforts together to address it in 2021. Volunteers may be needed. There's an excellent core group of people that have gotten things going, and I'm hoping that the SISMA can help ramp things up in addressing this, doing the RR, even though it may have spread a little bit more than we would have wanted it to by now. So volunteers may be needed, and I'm not sure that we know exactly what we're going to be doing yet, but my email is there, and so let me know if you're interested in maybe doing some pulling next year. So also, I'll just go back for a second, Corey, if it's easy to. This is a good photo of the roots, how they're kind of propped up. They're kind of propped up above the soil. I mean, you can't see them in the soil, but you can kind of get the idea. Another one, now, before we did this presentation, I asked Elizabeth what plants she wanted us to share with whatever time we have, and stiltgrass was one, and this is another one, giant hogweed. There are two really important things that I want you to know about this plant if you don't already know about it. Probably the most important thing to know is that it's toxic. It has toxic sap. The sap will burn your skin and damage your eyes. So if you think that you have a plant like this in your yard, do not touch it without gloves, and be very mindful of everything that touches the plant. The next important thing that you should know about this plant is that it's often confused with other members of the parsnip family. I should go back and say that giant hogweed is a member of the parsnip family. It's a long-lived perennial. It's a very aggressive competitor. It's found in disturbed habitats. Large plants can be 25 years old, and it can produce over 1,000 seeds that are viable for a decade. So it's quite an adversary here. So back to identification confusion. If you're familiar with if you're familiar with cow parsnip, it's a very large native plant. It's always, noticeable in the earlier summer, and all I can say is probably the best thing to do. I will also say that there's a handful of records in Vermont. It's not widespread, but it is popping up here and there. I know that I saw a confirmed record in Mount Holly, for example. So keep an eye out for it. It seems like it could just pop up anywhere on the side of the road or at the edge of a meadow. Okay, Corey, you can go to the next slide. So with regards to the ID, the best thing I think that you can do is to check out the New York DEC invasive species page. You can get to this from BT Invasives, there's a link, but this is by far the best sort of graphic side-by-side images for ID that I have seen. And what you need to know about giant hogweed, it is mature plants. They are giant. They are giant. So there would be some overlap in immature plants size-wise with cow parsnip and maybe even angelica, which is also pictured here. But just, it's taller. It grows up to 14 feet tall. The leaves are up to 5 feet across, as opposed to just a couple feet for cow parsnip. Leaves are more dissected, flowers are more dense, and the inflorescence, that's the kind of structure that holds all the flowers, an umbel, that is up to 2.5 feet wide on giant parsnip and only about a foot on cow parsnip. Sorry, giant hogweed versus cow parsnip. But all of these things, it sort of depends on the flowers being there or it being mature. When it comes down to it, the stem is the most reliable way to look at, to identify this plant. It has a ridged hollow stem that's hairy. You can see hairs around the collar there, particularly dense. And purple splotches are also a key factor there. So again, you know, if you think you see this plant on your land, don't touch it. Go check out this website and look for these features, and then go to Vermont Invasives and report it. So the next one is one that I've been really worried about since I started working in Brattleboro. These are the swallowworts. We have 2 species in the Northeast. Currently, I believe only black swallowwort is documented in Vermont. It doesn't matter. They're both twining herbaceous milkweed relatives. They're both extremely aggressive. They both essentially behave the same. In fact, it's even hard to tell them apart unless they're flowering. And you can see, I have a flower here, a photo of a flower of black swallowwort. It's a very dark purple flower. Pale swallowwort would be pale pink. But other than that, they're essentially the same. They might occupy slightly different habitats, but they are both really, really aggressive and hard to control. And I would say this is one to really keep an eye on if you live in the West River corridor area, if you live in Brattleboro, or if you live in the village of Green River. It's spreading, and by the time we notice it, it's too late, and it is really, really hard to control without herbicides. It smothers everything around it. The other thing that you may read about this plant, it's because it's a milkweed relative, that it may fool monarchs into laying eggs on it, and it may kind of sabotage the future of those eggs. I've heard, I've looked at the research, and some research does back this up, that this happens, and other research indicated that it doesn't happen that much. So I'm not really sure if it happens, but the main thing is that it will take over and reduce the diversity of a meadow. It likes light, but it also will go into the forest. Not so much hemlock forest, but it will go into deciduous forest. So how to identify this? It has, like milkweed, it has opposite leaves. They're sort of egg-shaped. They produce, actually you can go to the next slide, it might be better. So those are the leaves. That's from a plant that I saw in Green River. That's probably midsummer with what it looks like. It's a herbaceous twining plant, so it starts out kind of just looking like an herbaceous plant, and then as it grows, it wraps itself around things like it's a vine, a twining plant. The other picture is demonstrating what could happen to your yard if this gets into your field. This is along the West River Trail, adjacent to the new bridge. And then I don't have a good picture. I guess I didn't really put a good picture of the fruit, but it has these sort of narrow milkweed pods, and they mature and start bursting open. They mature in the late summer, and they start bursting open around mid-August and beyond. And then this is what it looks like in the winter. This was a plant I found along the West River in Newfane. And so, keep your eye out if you see this, as you walk your woods in the winter, definitely be alert. I would just underscore I'm going to be talking about a few plants today that aren't maybe even likely to show up on your land, but maybe you see them luckily as you're out hiking or in your travels. This is one that could actually end up on your land if you live in Windham County, and you want to catch it. Even if your property already has a lot of invasives on it, you want to catch this one early. right, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. It's kind of cold right now. We're having our first cold snap, but I want to take you back to a time in June when it was kind of warm and humid, and maybe you didn't like it at the time, but it kind of seems like it might be nice now, at least to me. And a little travel across over the Green Mountains to the other side of the state along the Battenkill River. And a beautiful wetland, a beautiful scene. And I was looking in this wetland for some invasives, and at first it just looks very beautiful and, you know, pastoral. You can go to the next slide. And I keep looking, and then I realized that in some areas, 90%, 90 to 100% of the cover is this yellow iris. And this is along the Battenkill in the wetlands that branch off of it, and it covers acres. So obviously this one is sort of out of the bag. So why am I bringing it up? Well, this is one, it's just so beautiful. Everyone loves it. I love it. But I do see it on people's properties. And I just want everyone to know that if you have this, or if you know of someone who has this planted in a wetland that's associated with a natural waterway, this could, their situation could eventually lead to this situation. I initially went out to this wetland knowing it might be there and thinking there might be a way to address it. And I quickly realized it was a lost cause. Unfortunately, it's a very hardy plant, and once it spreads to this level, the only way to address it would be herbicides, and in this case, I don't even think that would do it. So I would just, you can go to the next slide, Corey. I would just ask you, I'm bringing this one mostly because it is a common and lovely ornamental that a lot of people don't realize can be super harmful. These are just some identifying characters. I'm not going to list, I didn't provide a list, but essentially this is a much bigger plant. It can grow than your native blue flag iris. This is a plant where it's going to be much more noticeable in June, and you might not notice it other times of year. But if you see an iris, something with bluish sword-like leaves that are stiff, and it's much bigger than you would expect a native plant to be, then it probably, and it's in a wetland, it probably is yellow flag iris. What else do I want to say about this? It has these sort of pendulous fruits that are big. They're bigger than the native one as well. Yeah, actually, yeah, I will do this one. This was sort of like if we had time, but Elizabeth asked me to mention Tree of Heaven. Now we're kind of going back to not that common in the state. I think there's only a couple records of this, but we've looked at vine, we've looked at a beautiful flower, we looked at some parsnip. Now we're going to look at a tree. Tree of Heaven. And if you're from cities, you might know this plant. It was introduced and planted in cities because it's very resistant to pollution and it's fast growing. I've only seen it in relatively small organisms, small trees, but I guess it gets really big. It can be up to 80 feet. It resembles sumac, and so sumac, if you know that plant, it has these long compound leaves that are made up of these individual leaflets, and so this plant is very similar to that, and I'll point out some ways to tell them apart in a second. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that when you crush the leaves, it smells like peanut butter. A troubling thing about this plant, and a double reason why we want to make sure that it doesn't spread in the state, is because it is a host for the spotted lanternfly, which is an exotic insect that's in neighboring states that we're really worried about that kills all kinds of trees, especially some of our agriculturally important trees, such as maples and fruit trees. So we want to make sure that this spotted lanternfly doesn't have its host waiting for it when it arrives in the state. Like a lot of invasives, it likes disturbed areas. You can go to the next one. So obviously this isn't Vermont, but this was the best picture I could find of a thicket. These trees look kind of small. I guess they can, like I said, they can get big. But here's a really key factor. If you look at the leaf, it's sort of notched and it has these little glands towards the base. And this isn't the leaf, this is a leaflet. So it's the smaller unit of the leaf, of the compound leaf. And that's all I have about this plant. Okay. So, you can't learn them just from a slideshow, and it would be boring to do that anyway. So get out in the field, and hopefully when we have events, we'll be able to engage with the public more. But in the meantime, there's some really great resources to help you check the IDs of some of the EDRR plants that you might find on your land or across the state. Again, Vermont Invasives, they actually have an EDRR section on their page, as I mentioned. New York DEC has great giant hogweed. Go Botany, if you've never used it, it is extremely user-friendly botanical resource. The Windham County Natural Resources Conservation District, not only do they have recordings of these webinars, but there's also videos, short video clips of some folks identifying plants in the field that you can see. And the Northeast Risk Network, Jack, I meant to check this out. Can you speak on what's on that website? The Northeast Risk Network.
Yeah, Northeast Risk Network is a really amazing group of academics, and they are essentially assessing how climate change is interacting with the spread of invasive plants and the activization of plants that aren't currently invasive but have the potential to become invasive. So their webinars and associated material is really, really fascinating and cutting edge and terrifying, so worth looking to.
I like that word, activization. I couldn't figure out how to say that. Increase invasiveness, or yeah. So that's all I have right now, and we're excited to field questions, but also we'd love to hear what you thought of the webinar and to hear your suggestions. So there's a feedback survey, and Corey, do you have instructions on how that is accessed?
Yep, I just posted the link to the feedback survey in the chat box, and I'll also send a follow-up email to everybody who registered with that link as well. Thanks, Jennifer and Jack. And now we have some time for questions from folks. You can type them in the chat box, or you can just unmute and ask your questions.
Hello?
Yes.
I have a question. I have, it's an invasive, and unfortunately I missed the first half hour. I'm sorry. And I don't, it's in a field. It's creeping into the field. And I probably did the wrong thing. I mowed it down because I didn't want it to spread. And I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do, but with these invasives, what do you do if you see them, other than tell you people? That's my question. What do you do? And this is a very viney thing.
Oh, where do you live?
Up from Green River.
Oh, no.
Right.
So yeah, but is it herbaceous? When you say viney, is it woody or
Yeah,
Is it?
I would say it has. I don't. Was that the black one that with the black seeds? That was.
It also could be Asiatic bittersweet. There are other invasive vines in the area, so mowing is not a bad idea. To kind of hold it there as, with swallowwort. It's a way to keep it arrested so that it won't create fruit and spread. I'm not, and some people think that if you repeatedly mow it, it would actually reduce in vigor and maybe die. But it's just so stubborn that the best it will probably do is just kind of keep it in a holding pattern, and the key thing would be to prevent it from creating seeds. Jack, if she's talking about bittersweet, do you have a recommendation?
No, and I have bittersweet too, of course.
You have bittersweet too, Jack. Do you have comments about mowing?
I feel like you covered.
Okay, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's essentially the same. Yeah, and we have done some webinars that address, and we will be doing, I'm sure in the future, some more outreach events on how to tackle these. And of course, you're welcome to email us. And if you send a picture, we could probably give you a better idea of what you're dealing with.
Which group should I send it to?
I will.
Had a number of them.
Okay.
Northeast.
You can to my email. Do you two have a standard email that you've been using, or I could just give you my email. Give her my email.
Yeah, hang on. I can put this as my email in the chat. Just have to pull it up.
Are we and we are checking that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a better idea then. Use the SISMA email.
I'm sorry. Did you say?
The very first slide.
Of course I missed it. Of course, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So that's probably the best we can answer without knowing much more about it. But you didn't do a bad thing. It just might not give you a lot of, the progress that you're looking for. But feel free to get in touch with us to share your situation, and we'll see. We'll be able to give you better advice.
All right, that's great. And the bittersweet is pervasive. There's another thing. I've sort of found this interesting, that it seems like one year there was a very there was a viney thing that was very sticky. So you go to pull it up and it sticks to you, but it's very light and airy. So you can. Does that even ring a bell? And now it's gone. It just went away. It came. We had it for a couple of years. It was like Velcro. It was like a Velcro plant. You would grab it and it would stick to you, and it would stick to the plant that it was on, and it was very open, very, very open. It wasn't a dense plant. But and now it's gone, and now something else has taken its place.
Well, if it went away by itself, it probably wasn't invasive.
Oh, well, that's good to know. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
So I have a question about invasives in general. So we always seem to talk about invasives in relationship to our country, state, town, etc. What about these plants in their native habitats? Do we have any information about them? Are they balanced in any way by natural pests or resources? Should we be studying them in their natural habitats to see how to best deal with them? In this country, I don't seem to see that we've got any information from where they come from, or do we even worry about that being helpful?
Well, I can, do you guys, I have something to say about that. So without getting into any specific species we've talked about, I do know that the USDA and a lot of universities affiliated with USDA are kind of target some of these more problematic species and do research on diseases and predators, insects, pathogens that could potentially control these species. It really depends on funding and the motivation of, you know, for example, a lot of, if an invasive is causing a problem with agriculture, it's going to get more money for research. It also takes, I in the past was affiliated a little bit in this field, so I have a little idea, and it can take years and years and years, because anything that we might use that's from its native habitat, like a biocontrol agent, will have to be tested for years. But in terms of control, I think it is a great idea, and I do know that people have been looking into other weak points on the plant that wouldn't involve releasing a biocontrol agent. But you know, it isn't. It's usually in its own habitat. It's not causing a problem, so it's a little hard to gather that information. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. I guess, you know, just take one example, Japanese knotweed or whatever, the flag iris. Is that definitively an invasive in its own country? Do we even know that? Because like you said, some are
yeah.
not a problem in their own country, but, you know, is that because of natural controls there, as opposed to, you know, coming to this country where they get out of control?
That's typically the case for invasives, is that they don't cause a problem where they evolved to live, but you move them into another location and they behave badly and spread. Knotweed is also a problem in Europe, I believe. So taken out of its natural habitat, it's really wreaked havoc over a large part of the earth. But yeah, usually, and that's why we go back to the researchers, the people, USDA and universities. Researchers will go back to the original location of the native location of these organisms, insects and plants, to figure out, well, what keeps them down in Japan, what keeps them in check and in Asia or Europe, and they're trying to use that information. But it is hard. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to bring those other, you know, biological agents, the ones that keep them in check, into another area, because you don't want to cause a cascade. Do you guys have anything to add to that, Corey?
Yeah, I would echo everything you said, and note that CABI, CABI, is their acronym is. Do you know their acronym off the top of your head, Jennifer? What it stands for? I always forget. CABI.org is they work in partnership with the U.S. government and a lot of the European governments, researching biocontrols, and they are an interesting clearinghouse for some invasive plant species where there's more research done on them, like Japanese knotweed. They'll get into kind of the native range ecology, as well as, you know, discussing what controls them in the native range. And I'll put the link in the chat.
I have heard that there are some biocontrol agents that are being released for knotweed, and I think I posted something on the Facebook page back in the early summer, but you know, it's not a widespread thing. These things are kind of done, you know, piecemeal or just on a small scale to start, and they're not going to like eradicate it. They just might help control it, like purple loosestrife. A lot of places with purple loosestrife have the beetle, and what I've observed is the plants aren't as vigorous and are not spreading as fast, but they're not, you know, dying either. They're kind of, vigor is reduced. Should we go to the chat to answer a question?
Sure, yeah, there were a couple of questions in the chat box. Phil wanted to know about, while not a foreign invasive, where can I learn about managing invasive beech understory?
I would say if you have a forest and that's a problem, I would talk to your forester about that. It's usually forest management techniques that are employed to either to discourage that kind of thing. And I know it's a very, very common problem in forests. And sometimes, you know, it's an unintentional result of some forest management, even though it was maybe carefully planned to avoid that reaction that sometimes happens. So I don't really have a good answer for that. I think it's more of a forestry thing. Do you guys have anything to say about it?
I thought Sam Schnesky was on this list tonight.
I thought he was going to be under the radar.
If you wanted to, you could send an email to southeastvermontism@gmail.com, and we could probably connect you with a forester, or you could contact your local county forester. I don't know if that was what you mentioned, Jen.
Another question about knotweed, that it can spread when mowed because it can grow from the small bits of plant. And they asked if that's a real problem. And I think that's yes.
Jack,
Yeah.
I saw your presentation. That was cool. You handle that one.
So that one, yes, like many plants, it can spread from kind of fragments of itself. And there's some research that has come out in the last few years that they did trials, and they found that bits of fragments, of root fragments as small as 7 grams could resprout into a new plant, which is quite shocking. If you can picture 7 grams in your hand, that's a whole lot of nothing. So, and then you figure a mower, like a roadside mower, is throwing out hundreds or thousands or more of fragments. Yeah.
And there was a related question from Lan about controlling the spread of Japanese knotweed in Rutland County. And I can say that you might consider contacting NRCS to see if you can get some support for treatment. Typically, if it's a large infestation, I think you're going to want to go with an herbicide application. I don't know, Jack or Jennifer, if there are things you want to add to that. It's awfully difficult to take on otherwise.
I would agree with that if you really want to make some progress with it, especially if it's a bigger infestation, if you really want it to work, what you do, herbicide is the way to go. If it's a small infestation, then well, Jack, do you have any, and you've been looking into non-chemical means of controlling it? I know do you have anything to share on that front right now, or is it too early?
The only one that comes up repeatedly is from out of the state, so take it with a grain of salt, but the New Hampshire Invasive Species Coordinator is Doug Seigan, is pretty much sold on smothering when you cannot spray. So if herbicide is not an option, that is his statement is just, go to smothering. But that involves a significant investment of time and attention and potentially resources when it comes to sourcing your smothering materials, and is not for the faint of heart. So yeah, if you have more like specific information or want to dive deeper into like your particular situation, feel free or send us an email, and maybe something like a preventing knotweed on your property would be a good webinar topic for the next series.
And they asked what herbicide we would recommend, and I think you would want to speak with a licensed applicator, someone who's an expert in that particular field, and have their help figuring out how to do that. Somebody asked if iNaturalist data is used to detect invasives in Vermont, and I think that's a yes.
Yeah, it is monitored by Elizabeth Spinney and others, the botanists in the Fish and Wildlife Department, for, you know, so yeah, it is helpful. They do pay attention to it. For early detection, rapid response, Elizabeth requests that those records be sent directly through the website, but for general observations, iNaturalist is great.
Corey, if you don't mind, jump in a little bit and talk about the knotweed questions. In our previous webinars, there was a lot of interest in knotweed. So if you go back or if you were at any of those, you probably remember those discussions. There was a lot of talk about how to control it, and it's a particularly difficult one to control. You have to really understand, as Jack was talking about earlier, you really have to understand the phenology, or how the plant grows and how its various growth stages throughout the year sort of dictate the kind of treatment you want to do, especially with chemicals. If you spray it at the wrong time of the year, it just sort of laughs at you. So if you have a big infestation of knotweed, my recommendation to you, as Corey said, is see if you can get some NRCS funding to support you and get a professional to help you do that control, because it's pretty tricky. And if you go out and try to do it yourself, you may just end up spraying herbicides around and not making any difference. So check some of those older webinars. I think the one about chemicals, whether or not to spray, talked about it. And interestingly, the one that was about alternative methods for controlling invasives had a lot of talk about chemical control of knotweed. So check out those two webinars. And as far as the smothering goes, X-ray, that can be costly and labor intensive, and you can't just smother the area. You have to smother the area plus at least 6, if not 10 or 12 feet around the entire area that's infested. So that's what I want to say about that. I think there was another question Alan had about knotweed as well, along a stream. Oh.
Yeah, Alan, your question, you know, could just one person tackle the knotweed problem on their property and not necessarily worry about the other people being involved, or would it take really collective action to prevent that infestation from spreading, or to actually, you know, deal with it in a permanent sense? I think a lot depends on if you're upstream or downstream of your neighbors, but I think collective action, unfortunately, is probably going to be pretty important in terms of the long-term success of any kind of knotweed control project, especially in a stream situation. Unfortunately, I don't know, other people want to chime in on their experience or their thoughts on that.
Well,
Great. Are there other questions out there? All right. Well, it is after 8 o'clock, and I want to thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. And I hope you have enjoyed this webinar series. The SISMA will have future programming coming up. We haven't figured exactly out when and what it will be, but I would encourage you to check back to the Conservation District website, Windham County, nrcd.org. for details on future SISMA programming. And you can also sign up for the Conservation District newsletter there, where we'll keep everyone informed about programming. Thanks, Jack and Jennifer, for presenting this evening.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Corey.
joining us, everyone.
Send us suggestions for webinars.
Yes, please do.